Let's say you're sewing up a sewing pattern and you have your bodice sewn up, and now it's time to gather up and sew the skirt into the bodice. So I'm going to teach you exactly how to do this, and then I'm going to show you some things that you absolutely do not want to do because you can mess this up pretty easily. And the technique I'm going to show you today works for a dress that has a zipper or a dress without a zipper that you just pull over your head. The only big difference is one of them you got to leave an opening for a zipper. Today I'm going to be using the holly cowl top for my bodice pattern of the dress, and then I have this piece of fabric down here that I'm going to be gathering up to sew to the top to make a dress. Now I'm going to be showing you a really cool way to gather up fabric. It's my favorite way ever. But if you already have your fabric gathered up, just go ahead and skip ahead in the video. So our first step is making sure we have our fabric gathered up before we sew it into the bodice. So let's head over to the sewing machine and gather up that skirt. I'm going to be using the zigzag method. If you haven't seen this before, you really want to check this out. It is awesome. For this technique, I have my zigzag stitch selected. I have a width of 5 millimeters and a length of 4.5. That's right, we're going to use the zigzag to help us gather. Real quick, before we get into that, if you're enjoying sewing Anastasia, make sure you like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel a lot. And if you want to learn more about sewing, make sure you check out our online and in-person courses. There's links down below. Now, let's get back to those gathers. For this technique, you're going to hold your top thread. You're going to take your hand wheel and put it into the fabric and then all the way back up. And then you're going to pull that top thread and your bobbin thread is going to pop up to the top. And now you're going to take your bobbin thread and pull it up. And now your fabric is caught on that bobbin thread. So now what we want to do is pull out enough thread, the bobbin thread and the top thread, as long as our project. So that way we don't run out of thread. So quite a bit here because I've got a lot to gather up. And now I'm going to take that top thread, put it under the foot, and now we're going to zigzag over these two threads. So we've got two threads here, and we are going to zigzag over them. So we're creating a channel with the zigzag and the two threads. And I'm going to keep this close to the serge. And then if you want, you can pull those two threads and the fabric's going to start to gather up. This is a really nice, strong method for gathering. And you're just going to create this channeled zigzag with the two threads all the way down the piece of fabric that you'd like to gather up. Once you get to the end, you can cut your threads and we're done adding that stitch. We got that zigzag in. Let me show you how well this works for gathering. So you can see we have those zigzag stitches going over the straight stitches. And what we're going to do is hold those threads and then we can just pull our fabric down the thread and then it gathers it up beautifully. And the nice thing about this method is that it easily can ungather and you can move around the fabric on these stitches so you can really position it and get it as gathered as you want. You might have another favorite method of gathering like a gathering foot or the basting method, and that's totally fine too. This one's just my favorite. Before we go over sewing this in perfectly, let me show you a few things that you really want to avoid doing, and they're real easy mistakes to make. So this one's a super common mistake, especially if you're looking at a paper sewing pattern. So we got the fabric gathered and we need to attach it to the waist, but we have to make sure we're placing right sides together. We don't just want to place the gather on top and sew it down. We're always going to have to make sure that you're placing right sides together and sewing so that way when it pops back, the gathers are coming out of a seam and not on the outside of your dress. And no one wants this rough gathered seam showing up on the outside of your dress. The second mistake I see a lot of people creating is when they're sewing this seam, the little gathered edges are getting pulled back or under and it's getting all crunched up and funky. And then what happens is you end up seeing this edge up here on the outside of your garment. And when it lays funky, it also is going to affect the direction of the gathers. So we always want to make sure that our gathers are perpendicular to the seam we're creating. So we want this top edge up here to be super smooth and make sure you don't have any little fabric pieces getting tucked in or tucked over. So when you're sewing the gathers on, if these edges get flipped back and you end up sewing them down, which A can be kind of hard because it's bulky, Or maybe the edges actually end up going under the other way, which can happen easily. Or if it gets pulled over to the side and skewed, you're gonna see how bad this looks. So if we're not sewing down our gathers carefully, you can see we can end up with the fabric from the inside on the outside. You can end up with the gathering stitches on the outside showing where you zigzagged it. Also, if the fabric gets caught in a direction, it's going to start making some weird angles. So it's really important to make sure everything is staying perpendicular with the seam you're creating. Otherwise, you're gonna end up with these mistakes. Enough talk about things looking bad. Let's talk about how to make this gathered skirt look beautiful. First thing we want to do is make sure our gathers are nice and even, and that they're going to fit around the circumference of the waist here of the bodice. So if we leave it too long, it won't fit in. And then if we make it too small, well, it's not going to fit in the waist either. So what I like to do to make sure it's the perfect length is take my bodice. We're going to place right sides together, and I'm going to pin one end. That's a side seam for me. And then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to pin the other end. So now I can figure out exactly how much I need to gather up the waist of this skirt so that it fits perfectly into the bodice. And you can move around the gathers if you need a few more here or a few more there, or let some out here, let some out there. So that way it ends up perfectly even. Now, once you think you have it, you're going to start pinning it down. And before we pin it down, we really want to make sure it looks even. Make sure you don't have all your gathers on the right and none on the left. So now I'm going to start pinning up my skirt to the bodice. And I'm going to be putting my pins in so that way they're perpendicular to the seam we're creating. It's real important to line up these edges, make sure they're even, and make sure all those little gathers are going perpendicular to the seam we're creating, so that way you don't have any of those mistakes that happen. So I'm just going to continue pinning down the waist, making sure everything is nice and even and lined up. And the nice thing about this zigzag gather is that if you need to cinch it up or move it around or let it out a little, you totally can. Now I have my skirt all pinned into the waist of my bodice. Now at this point, what you really want to look for is making sure your edges are lined up, making sure the top edge of the fabric that you have gathered is pointing up perpendicular to the seam you're going to create. Make sure none of it's folded back or folded under, and just make sure everything's looking even. So right now, if you think you need to adjust something, add an extra pin, now is the time to do it. And once you have it right where you want it, it's time to sew it up. And to sew this down, I'm going to be using a straight stitch with a stitch length of 2.5. I am using a light to medium weight woven fabric here, so just make sure you choose the appropriate stitch width and length for your fabric that you're using. Now we're just going to sew these two pieces of fabric together, and I'm going to be using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm going to be sewing with the gathers facing up, so that way if I need to reposition or move any of them, I can while I'm sewing. I have my fabric lined up with my 1/2 inch on the sewing machine. I have my straight stitch on. We're back stitching in the beginning, and we're gonna sew right over the gathers. If you're new to gathers, this can feel a little awkward because the fabric is all bunched up. Just keep checking underneath, make sure everything's nice and flat. And you always want to take out your pins before you get to them. You never want to sew over your pins. It's really bad for your needle. It can dull your needle and ruin your fabric. Again, just keep checking that under layer to make sure it's flat. When you get back to the end, come all the way to the edge, back stitch. And let's take a look at our gathers. So let's take a look at those gathers and how we stitched them down. So if we take a look here, we can see that we have that straight stitch, and it is to the left. It is below those zigzag stitches. That's really important. And we have a 1/2 inch seam allowance here. You want to follow whatever the seam allowance is in your pattern, by the way. Mine just happens to be a 1/2 inch. And so if we flip this over, we just have a straight stitch showing on the flat side. And now let's open it up. So I'm going to flip this back. And now we can see all of those beautiful gathers coming out of the seam of our dress. So you can see that this does look great, but you can also see that the fabric wants to roll over towards the gathers. Now, a great way to secure the gather, give it direction, is to add an edge stitch or a top stitch to your bodice. And you want to make sure you're sewing down the seam allowance of the skirt to the bodice. And this is going to help give the fabric and your gathers direction. And it eliminates this bubble that you're seeing here where the two pieces connect together. So to give you an idea of what this top stitch looks like on the project, we're stitching from the right side. I've got my foot lined up, so I'm going to be stitching about 1/4 inch away from the seam here. And I have my seam allowance pushed up towards the bodice. So I'm going to be catching that seam allowance on the bodice here when I'm stitching it down. So we are stitching over the gathers again. So this is going to be thick. And I'm just going to continue this all the way down the waist, making sure everything is nice and flat. So I've added that top stitch, and you can see how the bodice now is laying nice and flat where it connects with the gathers. And I haven't even ironed this at all. This is just from sewing. So today you learned how to gather fabric into a bodice, how to get it to lay nice and smooth and flat, and what to look for to make sure you don't have any mistakes or gathers popping to the outside. Thank you so much for watching Sewing Anastasia today. If you have any questions about gathering fabric into a bodice for a dress, just leave it down below in the comments and I'll get back with you as soon as I can. And if you have any other videos you would like to see, leave that down below in the comments as well. And if you'd like to learn more about sewing, make sure you check out my online and in-person classes here in Chicago, Illinois. There are links down below in the description for everything. There's also an online sewing club where you get a new sewing pattern every month as well. And if you want to know what's going on in the studio right now, make sure you check out my Instagram stories. Thank you so much for watching today. Bye!